a manifesto for the future from a master documentary filmmaker who has been, and indeed continues to be, a major force in British television. A rallying call to arms, Roger, for more risk-taking and support for documentary makers to be given the time and the space to make their very best work about challenging subjects in this increasingly pressurised, ratings-driven world. If the documentary is in rude health, which I think Roger and I agree it is, I think it's thanks to people like Roger, whose remarkable energy, drive and utter commitment to filmmaking has kept the genre flourishing right at the heart of the television schedules. I think we've got a lot to thank Roger for. 50 years of filmmaking and over 160 documentaries. Credited with bringing fly-on-the-wall techniques to Britain, I realised that Roger is a man of many firsts. The first filmmaker to gain observational access to the UN, the EU, and a government ministry, never mind unprecedented access to the police, to our prisons, and on one occasion to make a musical documentary, family therapy, and sex offender units. The first to make a full-length film about Islam for Western television, the first to devise a television documentary co-production, for which we can all benefit from now. He co-produced the first comic relief event with Richard Curtis. He filmed the first 3 Amnesty International comedy galas. And in 2007, he was responsible for the first online doc-series for ITV.com, followed by Liz Merman's YouTube film about CERN. So only occasionally, as I went through everything, could I find what Roger was the last at doing. He's in his 70s. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Roger. But he's to be found every year at the Documentary Festival bar. I don't mean drinking, I mean discussing documentary, the art of documentary, networking, which is another one of Roger's great skills, well into the small hours, and in fact, he usually is one of the last to go to bed. Driven by a desire to make the world a better place, to push the boundaries with access and form, Roger's films have changed lives and perceptions and influenced policing and criminal justice policy. In 1999, his credibility within the police force led him to become an independent advisor to the Met Police on race. I thought that's got to be another filmmaking first. Should we go back in time?
Sure. Well, I'm in your hands.
Yeah. How did it all start,
Putty
Roger?
in your hands.
Was it something that you were interested in television as a child? Were you aware of documentaries growing up?
I grew up in a liberal, East Coast liberal household. My mother worked for the UN. My father was a doctor and helped immigrant doctors and black doctors. And, you know, I was campaigning for my grandfather at the age of 12 to run for Congress.
Okay.
And so I wanted to become a campaigning lawyer. And my hero was Clarence Darrow, from Inherit the Wind. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do, is end up being a judge or a lawyer. And I discovered, as I was going up to Harvard to study law, I asked my great uncle, what books on justice should I read? And he said, oh no, we don't teach justice, we teach law, and they have nothing to do with the other. That's the first lesson. So I thought, that's not really very exciting for me. So I ended up in the Harvard Dramatic Club and watched on the second year when somebody said, who wants to direct a play? I thought, oh, the hell with it, I'll try it, with a friend. And I watched the audience pay attention to the ideas I'd had for this rather strange play called Purification by Tennessee Williams. And I thought, that's it, social justice. If I can get into people's heads with experiences that generate a sense of either outrage or fairness or all the things that I wanted to do in court, then that's what I wanted to do. And I did it in the theater for 9 years and then in documentaries. But I will tell you, Charlotte, and everybody here, as Susan will tell you, I was about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I woke up next to Susan and I said, you know what? I'm doing what I set out to do all those years ago. And I hadn't really thought about it. I just kind of realized that 45 years later, whatever it was, I'd actually been changing, bringing social justice.
But you did 9 years, didn't you, of directing very successful plays?
Yeah, and
so where did that moment come when you decided television?
Well, I had a flop. I came over here, I had a successful play at the Royal Court, and then in the West End, another Tennessee Williams play called Period of Adjustment. And I was offered all sorts of, there was a Anthony Powell book, and I had the rights, and there was a play, and I had too many promises. I was 28, 27, and I was just completely kind of carried away with the possibility of you know, taking Broadway by storm and so on. And so I took a version of that play, which was actually with a crooked producer who ended up with Mandy Rice Davis. His flat had been used by Mandy Rice Davis. So, you know, really quite a bent character. And so I had my first flop. And I was so stunned that having wasted 2 years believing all these promises, I rang up the Thalidomide Society and said, look, can I do something useful with you? Because I've just pissed away 2 years of my life. And how about a benefit at the Palladium? And the thalidomide people said, no, we don't want that. Our kids are about to try and go to school, primary school, and we need the head teachers to understand that they have brains. They may not have arms, they may in some cases not even have legs, but they've got brains. So would you make a small film for a small group of head teachers showing that our children can cope?
So why did you choose Brett and his family?
Well, I have to be honest about this and say that I started, when I was given this commission, to do a kind of Brechtian drama about handicap and what all this stuff was about. And a friend of mine then, who some of you may remember, called Bill Morton, who was the co-editor with Desmond Wilcox of Man Alive, he said, this is rubbish. He said, this is complete garbage. If you're trying to influence head teachers, you want to show them, you know, what life is like for these kids. So he said, why don't you make a film that's going to tell the story of one child for another one, an intelligent 9-year-old, right? In television, when I was at CBS, we'd been told the audience were intelligent 12-year-olds. But this was even younger. Tell a child's story. So I just said, rather than get a more extreme example of handicap, we would take a nice kid who simply had no arms. And by giving people a way into the handicap through this sympathetic experience, that they could then start to understand it. And one of the really interesting scenes later on is when he goes to Chailey Heritage to get his arm fitted for an artificial arm. I made sure that he visited a much more handicapped hydrocephalic child in bed. And you could see Brett being shocked. He's shocked by that greater handicap. And then we meet another child with no arms and legs, and you see him trying to open a door with his flipper. And you suddenly get what she says in the film, that they use 95% of their brains instead of 50% like most of us. And that conveyed the point that they wanted. And the really interesting thing is that film was, we went to Oberhausen and Krakow and won prizes there. And then the BBC bought it, ABC Network showed it, CBC showed it, and it went straight into medical school curriculum. And that's when I thought, this is what I want to do.
It's a very intimate film, isn't it?
Yes, it was. What happened, my training, which was fantastically helpful, was I'd been at the Actors Studio for 3 years as an observer director. And so I was really fascinated by this idea of the significant detail. I remember as CBC guy who was an ex-Marine leaving the screening saying, I can't watch this, you know, these kids beating each other up with no food, with no arms.
The most wonderfully normal scene.
Yeah, well, exactly. No, but that's just the point. The normalization of handicap was the point. That intimacy was crucial. And I had to learn that, both from the cameraman and the editor, Terry Twigg, that just trust the material. What I was trying to say earlier, trust the material. Find good characters, trust the material.
But I think your eye for significant detail is a thread throughout your work, actually.
Yes,
and I think in that is when you have the patience to wait for that detail.
We filmed that first scene with a family in therapy. And the boy, who was the sort of neurotic one in the family, and that was why they were in therapy, started just doing this with his finger. And everything else looked completely calm. And I remember you went in to a close-up just on this. And that was a significant detail. And Charles had a real feeling for all that. And it was wonderful to be able to see something that otherwise you wouldn't. And that's where the screen works, taking you into people's homes, going deeper into them, and as long as you've got colleagues as talented as mine, then you do it without staging.
After Brett, you went into arts programming, didn't you, with the BBC? What led you to change from that, having got a taste for changing this young lad's life?
Well, I suddenly realized something which I think is quite interesting, and it was the time of civilization. And there's a wonderful story of Isaiah Berlin being asked what he thought of civilization. And you'll forgive my parody of the accent because I can't do it right. And he said, well, I do think Kenneth did awfully well, but he rather gave the impression that the whole thing could never have happened without him. And Hugh Weldon stood in front of everything and said, this is the art. And there was a sort of patronizing relationship between these experts and the content. And I thought, stand back, you know, get out of there, and let's just find out what it's like to be an artist, a sculptor, a composer, and so on. So, I mean, one of the things I'm proudest of in this work I was doing is I filmed Lipschitz taking, you know, a girl to a Jewish restaurant and telling her all about celery tonic and how it keeps your life lasting longer. He said, I heard that from Nam Gabo, and of course he's dead now. I mean, it was full, you know, sort of Jewish joke right in the middle of an arts film. And then, you know, Pierre Boulez at 3 a.m. opening his fridge, trying to find himself some food, and there's nothing, you know. And it's just turning these people into human beings. So that's my interest in arts, is bringing people so that they feel these are not special people on a pedestal. And that's why I love doing those comedy films. That, you know, as Mike was saying, we were filming a rehearsal for that, a wonderful, mad Monty Python scene. And Richard Leiterman was shooting that scene, was laughing so hard he had to lean against the side of the room. But, you know, they just carried on rehearsing. They didn't notice us. But we were entering a process differently than saying, right, tell me, your highness, you know, your greatness, why is it you're such a genius? You know, and that's changing that relationship between the viewer and the artist, I hope would empower them to do their own art, to go further and not see that it's something that belongs to Kenneth Clark. You know.
Which I think, you know, we can all see from the clips, actually, which we're about to show. Well, we'll show in a minute. Humanising was a big thing, but that makes it sound very easy that in the 60s you were just able to go to the BBC and go, look, Hugh Eldon, move over, it's Roger Graef. Was it an easier world?
No, because everybody worked inside the BBC except for us. But
because you were a freelance.
Yes, and Charles and Chris Wangler, we made this first film co-production about John Huston, wasn't it? That was the one. And because they had nicely said the films we'd made for CBC they wanted more of, I said, look, the money's pathetic for us as freelancers. How about us making the same film for you, the BBC, the CBC, and Americans? And they said, well, we need to have editorial control. You can't do that. And I said, look, you said you like the same stuff, but if the slots are different, just pay for what was called an internegative, your own version. We'll cut it your way, and that's that. And so you'll be amused to know that I wrote out a contract that said, party the first part, you know, three people invest, they get 50% pro rata for what they invested, we get the other 50%. I took it across Regent Street to a lawyer who wrote it up. It became 2 pages, and that was the first.
So you're a cunning deal maker as well.
Well, that was very straightforward. No, I mean that's the whole point. No, you know, no manipulation is the best manipulation of all, isn't it?
Just some clever,
play straight.
clever networking.
No, play straight, play straight. So it was in their interest, and they really loved the John Huston film. So then they said, "You want to make some more?" And Humphrey Burton was our patron, and Stephen Hurst. And we said, okay, we're going to do 13 portraits of artists and architects and so on. And they were really good films, if I may say so now. They still hold up. I saw the Gropius film the other day, and it's amazing. What we'd achieved, actually, by the time that the films were cut and shown, we achieved the trust with the commissioning editors. So when Aubrey Singer came, who was my group head, pyramid boss, came back from Florence 2 years after the flood, said, look, how about you going make a tribute film about this wonderful recovery from the flood? So I went back there and reccied it and thought it was just a corrupt mess, and came back and told him. And to Aubrey's great credit, he said, just get your facts right. And I then rang the Germans. Was it the Germans? Yes, the Germans and the Canadians and the Americans, and said, November the 8th, 2 years later, you'll have a film about this, and it's going to take the lid off this romance about recovery. And they all said, great.
You were asked by the arts department, weren't you, to make a film about communication and language. Right. Which, of course, being Roger, he decided to go that extra mile, and he thought, I'll go and get access to the UN, which I thought was, and the art of corridor bargaining, which, of course, I think Roger's quite good at, but he might not have realised that then. But we're about to see a clip from Diplomacy, aren't we, Roger, which is from the series, which was called The Space Between Words. And the whole film, which I really urge you to go and get out the series, actually, it's a great watch. But this whole film is centred around the meaning and the use of the verb to direct in a policy document.
The idea of trying to make films about communication in those days would have meant interviewing lots of people with pipes and, you know, very learned experts and all this stuff. And I thought, well, nobody's really going to understand what they're trying to communicate. So that would be just a sort of loop of disinformation. And instead, I thought, right, what we'll do is just observe 5 situations where communication is assumed to happen: family, school, work, politics, and diplomacy. So we did, and we got into the US Senate and filmed Mondale trying to deal with Nixon. We filmed a family in therapy. We filmed a school just Ackland Burley School up in Kentish Town, which some of you may send your kids to, and a very interesting work factory thing that almost led it to a strike in Poole. But the diplomacy, we tried all the time that we were filming, and Annie Labour, who's here, was busy negotiating too. We all tried to get into somewhere that was diplomacy. And the BBC, to its great absurdity, said, what about the Vietnam peace talks? That's a good idea. And we thought, no, I don't think that's going to work. But when we tried the State Department at the beginning, we said, can we do this? And they said, sure, you can do the border talks with Mexico and Canada. And we said, fine, so we'll be there with sound and sound. They said, no, you can't. No sound, please. Okay? And 1 year later, after we'd made 3-4 of the other films, we got a phone call in our little office in Broadcasting House. Annie, you will remember this, yes? And the State Department, it was a voice from the State Department saying, are you still interested in making a film about diplomacy? We said, yes. Well, the Assistant Secretary of State has a mission going to ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the UN, and they're happy for you to film it. And I said, with sound? Yes, bring your brownie. Right? So I went to Washington, checked that they really meant this, and then Charles and Ivan Strasberg, and that was Mike McDuffie, I think, wasn't it then? Anyway, you all came, and anyway, they all came, and we started filming. And in the State Department, everybody kept saying, who are these guys? They're wandering around completely, on stage. And they were trying to prosecute the Pentagon Papers in the next room and so on. And the UN was in turmoil because the Third World was trying to get into the Security Council and ECOSOC. So that was the big story. And the whole of Geneva was, press corps were following that around. And there's 77. It's called the Group of 77. And we thought, that's a bit too much for us. But we did, just in terms of the principle I was giving you, start with that and start with whatever else we could. And then we suddenly realized that this one, rather like choosing Brett instead of a really handicapped child, that this one proposal from Ambassador Bush, as he was, to set up a disaster relief coordinator with the power to mobilize, direct, and coordinate UN agencies was causing ripples, and more than disquiet. They were having trouble. And we just suddenly said, right, that's what we're going to do, make a film, that one word. And we filmed for 3 weeks. One word. We always show the films to the people we'd filmed in Access Films. And we had a screening in Geneva, and everybody came, and Bernie Zagorn, who was that chap, had 2 secretaries holding his hand, and he was sliding onto the chair as he watched, so he was kind of mortified by this. But I had checked with Kathleen, his assistant, and she said, because I said, are we going to ruin his career? And she said, no, that's what he's like. Anybody who's worked with him would know that. So don't worry about him. But afterwards, the next day, I sat by the swimming pool at the Hotel Intercontinental as Bernie sat there receiving, paying, everyone paid court to him saying, you were great, he was fantastic, just like the Marx Brothers, all this stuff, okay? And then somebody, the Spanish ambassador came up, the Italian ambassador came up and said, the Spanish ambassador, Bernie, is really unhappy. And I thought, oh God, here we go. And I said, wait a minute, he's not in the film. That's why he's unhappy. So, it was a whole movie.
But you said that, we always show the films, but this must have been the first time you didn't always show all of your arts films to people, did you? Or was this a stance that you took right from the beginning?
Right from the beginning.
Well, did everyone at the BBC show their films to their contributors back then?
No, by no means. And the other thing I did was I brought the editor to the screenings at the BBC, and they kept saying, what's he doing there?
But this was also quite a sea change in the sort of films you were trying to make, I think, wasn't it? And was that a deliberate decision, or was it when you got the material into the edit?
It was when Charles and I were filming in the US Senate. I remember sort of giving you sort of direct, pan right and left, and you turned around to me and said, look, tell me what you want generally and leave me alone, because by the time I've heard you, it'll be over. We immediately went into training for the State Department, the UN, and the Foreign Office, which I'm proud of.
And what was your shooting ratio, Roger?
30 to 1.
30 to 1, which of course at the time on film, most people would have been shooting what, sort of 15 to 1, so you would have 10 to 1. So
but we used the lighting budget and put it into the film budget. No, we did. In fact, that whole series came in slightly under the original budget. You'll never guess. The whole budget for the series was 100 grand, right?
No,
and we came in at 96. And I said to Chris Brasher, who was our department head, can we have the money, please, for the next film to develop it? And he said, no, we're keeping it.
Did it feel like a golden age at the time? This freedom that you could just disappear and...
No, I think insofar as we had a golden age at all, when I don't believe in it, it was at Granada. When, again, we had a little cell of people and we could follow institutions the Norma Percy would get the access, and Brian Laughing would be the exec, and we would enter these worlds for 4 months. We were inside the DTI for 4 months, you know, and we would also commute to the EU, and you know, we were in these amazing places. That was golden age in terms of just the amount of time we had and the backing we had to try things. I managed to succeed to get access to all of the TUC, and on another occasion to all of NATO.
And it was around that time, wasn't it, that you set up Films of Record and you decided
79.
Yeah.
That was after the strike and after we had done our Amnesty films. The first film really from that was The Secret Policeman's Ball, I think.
Did other people do the same? Was Films of Record a bit of a beacon at the time?
Yeah, it was a bit of a beacon, yeah. No, we were at Alan King Associates, we were the first independent to work, get films onto television. It was all in-house. Films of Record was, we were going to propose to companies that we'd come in and do evidential films. And I had a rather tough time. Granada had split, and I was just going through some sort of personal difficulties, really. I wasn't very happy, and the Germans rang up and said, would you like to make a film about Nazis in Argentina, right? And I thought, oh my God, if I'm feeling a bit depressed, that's not a great idea. So then Chris Curling rang up from Bristol and said, I don't suppose you'd like to make a film about the police in Bristol. So I said, oh yes, I would. And then we spent 3 or 4 months checking out all the police forces, and that became the police series. That film, you know, is in one room with 3 people for most of the time. There are 2 cops in it before that. It's 1.5 to 1, no music, no commentary, no staging. That's trusting your material. And it was probably the Policy Studies Institute said it was the most influential film ever shown on the BBC at the time of their report.
What did the police think of it when you showed it to them?
Well,
before transmission?
Very, very interesting, because when the cops saw it first, they just said, well, she was, you know, would have been a terrible witness. We get a lot of people like that. You know, what's the problem? But the chief constable saw it in our cutting room in Bristol, and he said, I wish you had another case. Do you have another case? And we said, we tried 5 other cases, this is it. And he was a governor of the BBC at the time. No, he was on the advisory council of the BBC and could have made more of a fuss about it. He didn't. And to his credit, Alan Yentob did a sort of special special on the impact of this, and invited all the cops from Reading without letting us go. And the chief superintendent, who had been given a very good meal by the BBC and had definitely seen it and told everybody else, said, well, if only we'd seen this film, we would have stopped it. So the answer is, once it came out and people were so critical, the rest of the cops started teasing Thames Valley. They said, you know, nothing to do with us, and you guys were incompetent, and it really was a very big embarrassment for Thames Valley. But quietly, they all changed the way they handle rape cases. And we kept saying, why don't you take credit for it? You know, I mean, if you've been sensitive and you're learning, but it took them years to finally acknowledge it, and now they still show the film in training.
Were there other people doing the same thing? Did it become more of a genre cross?
Well, yes, people were doing more, they were doing more unstaged films, and indeed the police series led to The Bill, and quite a number of feature films were using what then became known as wobbly scope, you know, handheld, unlit, and so on, because the intensity, I mean, we were averaging 10 million viewers for 11 weeks with an unstaged, no commentary, no music. Can you imagine?
And did that become harder?
And not much excitement, by the way, as well. It was just intimacy.
Because it was around that time, wasn't it, that Channel 4 would have just started?
Yes, yeah.
And what difference did that make to you? What did that sort of signal the change in documentaries?
Channel 4 really took risks. They, you know, there was an entire night of Pina Bausch from the Sadler's Wells, an entire night of Pina Bausch, which was the most magical kind of thing. And and King Lear and all the Orstaya was on, and you know, that sort of feeling that you've got this chance to reach people. Let's use it.
And it allowed you, didn't it, to go on to make films, Channel 4, about the police, about criminal justice.
Yeah.
And there was a series you made about law and order in the UK. Yeah. And then our next clip is actually from a film you made about American criminal justice.
Yes.
Should we show that
clip?
Well,
can I just quickly introduce it? Because actually what had happened was that because of this sort of gap, I wrote a long book about the police. We interviewed 600 coppers and then did a series inside Wandsworth Prison, and I had been asked by a journalist, by the Sunday, whatever it was called, the correspondent, to write a piece about why judges send people to prison. And I thought, I must know, because I spent all this time with cops. And actually I realized when I interviewed people that they all said the same thing, and it wasn't what I expected. Do you want to guess what it was?
No.
they said, we didn't know what else to do. And I thought, what? All this waste of life, all this waste of, not good enough. So I then set out in about 91, it was the time of the Strange Ways, right, to find them something else to do. So I went literally around the world looking for this. And so the first series was in the UK, and I won't bother explaining how that happened, but the next 3 were in America. And I had found this scene in Boston, which had a lot of black-on-black gun crime. And they had people called street workers, who were themselves ex-gang members, who acted as liaison between the gangs and the courts and so on. That series became part of the Youth Justice Board, and they invited, the Home Office invited everybody in our series, the street workers, people from all the different parts, Fort Worth, San Francisco, to London, and to talk to probation officers and to try and design the Youth Justice Board work around some of these models. So it did have an impact, yes.
And it was around then that you were very much sort of a criminologist as well as a filmmaker,
Yeah.
and wrote books about it.
Yeah.
Which is
offenders
extraordinary to think of all the films you were making and you were doing all that.
Well, I just wanted to get closer to the people. I followed, during this sort of gap, I followed 10 young offenders for nearly 18 months. I went to their courses twice and then kept going back. We did a Radio 4 series, and I just was getting to know. I mean, just one thing I want to say. This is a privilege, okay? My entire 50 years has been a privilege of entering people's worlds where normally people don't, and seeing as, being part of that conversation. I just turned up at midnight with these guys who had no idea who I was. A white guy in the middle of the night with a high-8 camera just moving around with this, and they're talking about life and death stuff. And this is the great privilege about being a documentary filmmaker, but my sense is we have to pay respect to that. We can't just take advantage of it. So that's the deal, it seems to me.
Your career really became, as an exec, as you said,
Yeah.
after September Morning, you thought, I want to exec films rather than always feel I have to direct them.
No, as my board said, you'll never make a company work if you have to direct each of the films.
So you were banned, pretty much.
Well, encouraged not to, I think is a better way to...
And how did you feel that sort of changed the way you were? Was it difficult making the decision to not direct, to put down that? Because you'd become such an author. No,
but I'll tell you, it's a very
director.
interesting point. Up to that point, I had thought I was essential, that I had a particular vision, all that stuff. But actually, it wasn't just working with Charles, who actually co-directed a lot of that police stuff. But I then started working with directors like Molly Deneen, who made... I didn't work actually with Molly, but Molly was an inspiration for me. It was Kim Longinotto. We'd always talked about working together, and it never quite panned out. But Kim Longinotto made Hold Me Tight, Let Me Go better than I ever would. It was a film I really wanted to make, but when Kim did it, I just thought, yippee, she's done better. And Feltham Sings, which Brian Hill directed, he did a brilliant job. And the Requiem for Detroit, Julian Temple. These are wonderful filmmakers, and I feel privileged to be able to facilitate them and share my experience to make sure that, that the films work insofar as we can. And the whole experience has been collaborative. I have learned more from the people in this room that have worked with me than I think I've taught them, because they know things I don't. And that's the same way about going into these unstaged situations where I don't know what happens in a British Steel boardroom, but we discover it. See, one of the things I've tried to do all through the years of making films is to provide a safe place for people in authority to admit they don't know, to admit that there are things that are just too hard or just hard. And it seems to me that's this change in the relationship with the audience, so that they don't just have to feel all these people are on pedestals and they can't be approached. And the best thing that's come out of Great Ormond Street, when we had that meeting, and Simon will remember, the feedback meeting after the second series, which I thought was going to be, oh God, who did we offend and all of that. You remember, it was in your office. And the woman said, no, the doctors like it, the nurses like it, but the real benefit is that the parents who come now to the hospital have more realistic expectations, and that makes our life and work so much better. And I thought that was, frankly, much as I love the BAFTA tribute, that's the most important thing we could have done.